Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Future Cities. I'm your host for the month, Stephen Elser, a PhD candidate at Arizona State University. In this month's episode, we're going to talk about various terms that are used to describe nature in cities, the trees, the parks, the wetlands, and the many other examples of nature in cities. So there are lots of different terms to refer to nature in cities. Maybe you've heard the terms green space or open space, for example. Nature-based solutions is a quite common term, especially in Europe, though it's a term that organizations like the Nature Conservancy use here in the United States as well. Green infrastructure is a term that's pretty popular here in the US, and one that you've heard us use many times before in previous episodes of this podcast. So, which of these names is best? And why does a name really matter? Well, names do matter, I think, for a few reasons. For one, names add clarity. So let's take the term green infrastructure as an example. In the way that I and my colleagues generally define it, green infrastructure refers to natural or semi-natural spaces in cities that provide some range of benefits to people. However, that's not what the term means to people outside of our field of study. So green is frequently used by the public to refer to anything that's environmentally friendly. Recycling is green, renewable energy is green, sustainability is green. So when you say green infrastructure, it's not necessarily clear that you're referring to that sort of use of natural features to provide services that I mentioned before. One might just be referring to infrastructure to support recycling or more clean energy. So for example, see the recent headline about Joe Biden's plan to spend $2 trillion on green infrastructure if he's elected president. In this case, the green infrastructure plan is mostly referring to improving public transportation and shifting towards the use of clean fuels. So what my colleagues and I refer to as green infrastructure is not at all the focus of this plan. So it's clear that the term green infrastructure can mean different things to different people. And even within my own field, people can't always agree on what is and is not green infrastructure. So in a case like this, perhaps it's obvious that we might want a different term to be more clear about what we mean. So names also matter in that they convey certain values. By using some names over others, it communicates what sorts of things we find important or what our goal is. As a quick example, using the term green stormwater infrastructure pretty clearly conveys that the goal is to regulate stormwater in some way. Later in this episode, we'll hear from Jason Sauer as he describes what he calls heritage forms of natural infrastructure, and what that term means in the context of the research that he does in the communities in which he works. Before that, though, I interviewed Dr. Dan Childers about a term that he and others wrote about in a recent paper, urban ecological infrastructure. You may remember him from an episode a few months ago where he and I discussed how the field of urban ecology has changed over time. In our conversation today, you'll hear him make arguments for using the urban ecological infrastructure term to describe nature in cities, how that term differs from other terms to describe urban nature, and some examples of notable urban ecological infrastructure features in the Phoenix area. Here's our conversation.
I'm Dan Childers. I'm a professor in the School of Sustainability at Arizona State University. I'm also the director of the Central Arizona Phoenix Long-Term Ecological Research Program.
Could you just, first of all, just define what is urban ecological infrastructure?
Absolutely. We have a paper that just came out in the journal Elementa on this, and in the process of writing and rewriting that paper, I discovered in a journal I had actually never even heard of that there was a what did they call it? A symposium. It was in Beijing, China, sponsored by the Chinese Academy of Sciences forum. I guess it was a forum in 2013 on urban ecological infrastructure. And a series of papers, in fact, a special issue came out of that, almost exclusively with Chinese scientists as authors and co-authors of the papers, in a journal called the Journal of Cleaner Production. Yes. Okay. Have you heard of that before?
No, never.
I hadn't heard of it before either. And I just, after digging and digging, because one of the criticisms we got originally was that my co-authors and I had come up with a new jargon term, that
Yeah.
something new, and that we were being arrogant, first of all, to claim that we needed to be the ones to find some new term for something that already is pretty jargon rich, and which is nature in cities.
Yes.
So it turns out we didn't invent the term at all. It came from this symposium in Beijing in 2013. The challenge is that their definition of urban ecological infrastructure was so broad and so all-inclusive that it didn't really hold weight to us. And so our definition of urban ecological infrastructure is really simple.
Okay.
It is everything, all infrastructure in a city that is capable of supporting ecological pattern or ecological structure and ecological function, right? And so if you think about it, that means UEI is basically everything but the literal built environment. Okay. So UEI, as we think about it, there's a bunch of examples of UEI that immediately would come to anyone's mind. Parks, street trees, everyone's yard. Yards are probably the largest coverage of UEI in a city. Which is interesting because each one is individually managed with different rules, different norms, different perceptions, preferences, and let's see, urban lakes are UEI, urban wetlands are UEI. But vacant lots, right? There's all kinds of microbiological and biogeochemical things going on in the soil of vacant lots. Right? Here, vacant lots aren't vegetated because they're not watered, right? But that dirt is still doing stuff. So vacant lots are definitely urban ecological infrastructure. A flower pot on someone's front porch has soil in it. It's got a plant in it. If that plant is blooming, that plant is supporting pollinators, and that plant is giving whoever walks back and forth across that front porch every day a little jolt of pleasure, right? That flower pot and the plant in it is urban ecological infrastructure.
So it could be very small scale to large scale as well.
As long as it supports ecological structure and function.
So in this paper that you wrote, I know a swimming pool, for instance, is not urban ecological infrastructure.
It's not, right. Because by putting chlorine and other chemicals in it, which we do, we essentially do that to make sure that it is not an ecosystem, an ecological system, right?
So
we don't want algae growing.
That's right. Can go in there.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
So I'm curious, at what point from stopping chlorination in a swimming pool would it become urban ecological infrastructure in your eyes? It's as soon as
as soon as it stopped being managed.
As soon as as a stray algae could start to grow.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And so I had somebody ask me a question when I was giving a talk about urban ecological infrastructure not too long ago. And it was here, I don't remember where it was, but it was here. And someone raised their hand and said, so we have javelina come and drink out of our pool all the time. Doesn't that make it urban ecological infrastructure? And I was like, so I had to think about it a minute. I thought, okay, well, that pool is providing a service, not necessarily, well, I guess it's kind of an ecological service. It's providing a service and a benefit to those javelina. And I'm sort of talking through this as I'm trying to figure out what the answer is. And I said, do you like javelina? And they're like, oh, no, they're ugly and they're a pain in the butt. And so your swimming pool then is actually attracting organisms that you don't benefit from and that you don't like, right? And so not only is your swimming pool not providing ecosystem services, right? It's not providing any ecological structure or function that's generating benefits for you. It's benefiting organisms that you don't like, right? And so to me, that swimming pool is still clearly not UEI at that point.
So what about urban wetlands, lakes, rivers? Those are all UEI. What about a canal? Would that qualify as UEI?
I think so. Yeah, just because it's concrete lined doesn't mean there isn't plenty of primary production going on in there. The canals around here all have fish in them.
Oh yeah.
Right, and so there's an entire trophic interaction going on there. There's all sorts of ecosystem processes going on in there, and there are people. I mean, there's places in the city of Scottsdale where they've turned their canal into a major urban amenity.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, I would say the canals around here are as much UEI as Tempe Town Lake.
So I think that's something that's really exciting about this term is that it does include such a diversity of infrastructure features. So things that are heavily designed, like these canals and concrete lines, channels, to potted plants, to trees, to you name it. I think that's really great. But so getting back to this point that you received, this comment that you received in reviews about, well, this is just another jargon term. Because we already have words to describe
got a bunch of words.
UEI. There's
bunch of concepts.
Green infrastructure, which I've used. We have episodes about green infrastructure on this podcast. We've talked about it a lot. There's nature-based solutions. There are other ones that I can't think of off the top of my head right now, but these are already terms that are out there in the cosmos, and people are using them pretty frequently. Even people like practitioners I know really like the term green infrastructure, or at least using it fairly frequently on their own. And when I've had conversations with some collaborators about, well, should we be using the term green infrastructure or should we be using this urban ecological infrastructure term? I've gotten feedback, well, the practitioners that we work with, they're already using green infrastructure, so we should probably just stick with that so it's not cause any new confusion. So why, in your mind, should we adopt UEI or urban ecological infrastructure over just maybe adapting definitions of already existing terms?
Sure. So for starters, I'm not being a militant activist about this, right? I don't carry a soapbox around with me, and every street corner I have to stop and wait to cross the light. I'm up there, I'm preaching the UEI, the UEI sermon. So I'm not about that, but I do think that there are some from an ecological perspective, there are some important limitations of all of the other terms that are used for nature in cities. Let's start with GI, right? Green infrastructure. For starters, most of the time that term is used by practitioners, it's being used in a very terrestrial-centric way. Most practitioners would not refer to Tempe Town Lake as green infrastructure, right? But Tempe Town Lake is nature in city,
definitely,
right? And so it's missing Tempe Town Lake. So that the terrestrial-centric part of it is something that bothers me. Because when we think about green, we think about terrestrial ecosystems. But the other thing, the part that I think is particularly worrisome about the term GI is that when you get outside of the world of urban ecologists, urban scientists, and practitioners and decision makers in planning and that kind of thing in cities, and out into the general public, GI means something completely different. It has environpolitical decisions that have nothing to do with nature in cities. Right? And so to the general public, if you ask people, what is green infrastructure, they would tell you recycling programs, solar panels, electric cars, right? These in more environmentally friendly infrastructures and concepts. And that leads to some very real confusion. That could lead to some very real confusion. And so that's my problem with GI. Another one that is commonly used more recently here in the States
before we move on to that, just to talk about GI a little bit more. So GI, just for clarification, would still exist under the urban ecological infrastructure umbrella, correct? So GI, green infrastructure, is UEI, just a subset of it.
Absolutely, it's basically the terrestrial parts of UEI, right? The problem, because of its terrestrial centricity, is that the concept doesn't really seem to openly embrace aquatic systems or wetland systems. Right, and wetland systems, as you know, are unique because they have characteristics of both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, and so they're either both or neither, and so they are wetland ecosystems are their own. So another term, urban green space, that you see used recently, I don't really know what the difference between that and green infrastructure is, except because it's a more recent term. Their definition seems to imply that urban green space does include at least aquatic systems. But the definition of that gets a little bit more complex, almost like the original Chinese definition of UEI, because it includes things like connectivity to green space outside of the city and stuff like that. And so it also is terrestrial centric because it's still got that green in there. But I don't think urban green space, UGS, is something that's going to have an environmental political confusion. And so that's one positive thing about it. The other one that you hear a lot is nature-based solutions.
Yeah.
And that's a very European-centric term.
Yes.
That's becoming more common here. And on our UEI paper that just came out a couple of weeks ago, one of our co-authors is an environmental engineer at the University of Strasbourg. And so he brings to the table, or brought to the table, all the inside scoop on what NBS means in Europe. And the challenge that Paul has with NBS as a concept for nature and cities is that it is a very solutions-oriented, very engineering-centric concept. Now, whether that's the same way that it's being defined and perceived here in the U.S. when it's used, I don't know. But NBS in the sort of European way of thinking about urban solutions tends to be, NBS is always focused on a single problem, and these nature-based solutions providing a single solution, right? Which is the way engineers think about things, right? And nothing against engineers. They're generally given a problem, and they have a way of solving it, and so they have a solution. And the problem with that is that pretty much anywhere that you find UEI in a city, that you find nature in a city, that's going to be providing multiple benefits, multiple ecosystem services. And if it was designed and built as a nature-based solution, then the benefit that it was built to provide is one of only many, right, ecosystem services that UEI is probably providing. And so the whole NBS thing tends to be single solution, single benefit centric, and that's a problem. The nature-based solution definition very clearly includes aquatic and wetland systems in it. And so that's not the problem. The problem is that it's not expansive enough in terms of making that ecosystem service bridge back to human benefits, and imagining, or at least envisioning, that pretty much any form of UEI is going to provide multiple benefits besides the ones that it was designed to provide.
Excellent. So you've talked a little bit about some already, but could you give some examples of some prominent or unique UEI features in Phoenix?
Oh, unique UEI features in Phoenix. Vacant lots. And I say that because most people wouldn't think of vacant lots as being even remotely ecological. Because here it's just dirt.
Just empty. It's barren.
It's empty, barren dirt. Sometimes there's gravel, right? There's no plants. How can it possibly be alive? We have some pretty spectacular urban parks and preserves here. South Mountain Park, which is a City of Phoenix park, is the largest urban park in the world. That statistic blew me away when I first heard it. Holy cow! And so, in terms of scale, I think we have some really amazing UEI here.
I know there's one that I think is pretty unique, or at least has been well studied here, and that's the accidental wetlands.
Yes. Okay. So accidental wetlands are definitely not unique to Phoenix. I would be willing to bet that the accidental wetlands here in Phoenix have been better studied than those in most other places. And so, for them to be accidental, I guess we should define what we mean by accidental wetlands, right? And so, in a place without water, wetlands can only occur when there is a confluence of water on a regular basis, and some topographic ability to hold that water in place. So as of the late 1930s, when we finished the last of 7 dams and reservoirs in the Salt and Berry rivers, since then, we've sequestered 100% of the flow of those two rivers. We bring it in canals, and the Salt River running through the middle of Phoenix, down the Phoenix Valley, is a dry riverbed. It is no longer a river in the parlance of it being a river, the interesting thing is that because we are living in a valley, and because that valley has a river, or used to have a river, now it has a riverbed, that riverbed is the lowest place in the valley. And one of the things that water does really well is it follows the laws of gravity. And so all of our stormwater systems here that don't hold stormwater in place, that ultimately discharge it to the Salt River, because that's the lowest place.
Mm.
And so there are some stormwater outfalls coming into the Salt River bed in places along the valley that are draining a large enough watershed of the city, what have been referred to as pipe sheds, draining a large enough area that those stormwater outfalls have water coming out of them constantly. And so even with all of our water conservation efforts here, Phoenix is a leaky city, and if you have a large enough area, these stormwater outfalls have water coming out of them constantly, and the areas around in the riverbed around these perennial flow stormwater flows they're not stormwater flows, they're stormwater pipe flows, are teeming with beautiful wetlands, right? Because wetlands essentially, just add water and soil, and wetlands will happen. Easy. They will happen. They're accidental because they were never planted, they were never designed, and they are not being managed, right? But you find wetlands like that probably not associated, especially in more mesic cities. They're not associated with storm drain point sources, right? They're often associated with riverbanks of streams or something like that. But there are definitely, because in order for them to be accidental, by our definition, they really simply need to be not designed, not managed, and not planned, right?
One of the major UEI features that are prominent in cities that you mentioned earlier are residential landscapes, and I know that CAP has done a lot of research on yards.
Yes.
I know you don't specifically do much residential landscape research, but could you speak a little bit about the sorts of research that CAP is doing on residential
areas? Sure. So we have 12 neighborhoods that are what we call the PASS neighborhoods, the Phoenix Area Social Survey. And every 5 years we go into those 12 neighborhoods and we survey all of the residents of those neighborhoods about a whole variety of things. And one of the things that we every 5 years ask them questions about is, in the last 5 years, have they changed anything about their yard? We ask them how they changed it. We ask them about how they're managing it, managing their yards. We ask them if they treat the front yard differently from the backyard. That's what our Baltimore colleagues have come to refer to as the mullet hypothesis. And it turns out people in both Baltimore and Phoenix make very different decisions about their backyard than about their front yard. We ask them about their perceptions of their neighborhood, and do they have a good or bad feeling about their neighborhoods? We ask them questions about their perceptions about the variety of birds that they see in their neighborhood, for example, because we do regular twice-a-year bird counts in all of these neighborhoods, so we know what the species diversity of the birds is. And then every 5 years, we also do this thing called the Ecological Survey of Central Arizona, or ESCA, where we have 200 and some points scattered around the Phoenix Valley. And we revisit those points every 5 years and basically measure everything ecological you can imagine. And a bunch of those points happen to fall in people's yards, right? And so we're able then to directly relate people's decision-making, people's perceptions, people's values, about their immediate surroundings, their yard and their neighborhood, to bird community diversity, and to a whole array of biophysical variables. And the ESCA sampling and the PASS sampling are in 2021 for the first time going to be done in the same year. And so there's going to be an absolute temporal relationship. We also have a group of folks involved in we have one of our research teams, IRTs, is called the Residential Landscapes and Neighborhoods team. And that is about as interdisciplinary a group of scientists as you'll find in CAP, which is already pretty interdisciplinary. And there's a group of those folks who've been working on another NSF-funded project called the Urban Homogenization Project. And that project involves work in 6 different cities that are very different climate zones, very different in all kinds of ways, culturally, all across the United States. And the hypothesis was that even in these places that are very different climatically and very different culturally, that yards, in terms of ecological structure and function, and in terms of the way they simply look, are going to be much more similar than the environments that these cities replaced when they were urbanized. And so a lot of really cool work has been done by those folks. In fact, they've come in and taken soil cores out of my yard, which is kind of fun.
That's fun.
Yeah. So lots and lots of stuff. And again, I would be willing to bet that if you wanted to sit down and do a typology of all the different types of UEI that you'll find in cities, I think I would never do that, because if it's basically everything but the literal built environment, there's going to be huge variety what you're going to find. But I bet if you did a typology, that the residential landscapes, that basically people's yards, by far and away is the largest by coverage. Except here, maybe not, because we have all of these really big urban parks and preserves, right? And so maybe that would be our largest by area, but certainly the second would be the compilation of all of these yards, probably more than 1 million yards scattered across the valley.
Yeah.
Being managed in 1 million different ways, perhaps.
One thing that I like so much about the urban ecological infrastructure term is how inclusive it is. Where other terms are rather restrictive, urban ecological infrastructure explicitly includes such a wide diversity of urban nature. Admittedly, though, I don't always use the term. I use it in academic settings, but when I'm interacting with practitioners, I say green infrastructure. And if someone I just met at a party or something asks what I do, I'll say that I study green space. While the urban ecological infrastructure term is good, I do think that it is perhaps a bit too jargony for use in all situations. So next up, I talk with Jason Sauer about his take on the terms we use to describe urban nature. He uses the term heritage wetlands to refer to the system of wetlands that he studies in Valdivia, Chile. You'll hear his explanation on why he uses that term and what the implications of that framing are for his work. So to talk a bit more about the terms we use to refer to urban nature, I'm bringing in Jason Sauer, who most of you probably already know from previous episodes since he's one of the show's co-hosts. But just in case, could you reintroduce yourself, Jason?
Hey, Stephen, thanks for having me on. So my name is Jason Sauer. I am a PhD candidate over at Arizona State University in my 4th year of doing this. And I've been on previous episodes talking about, in particular, green gentrification, for example, and resilience of the undocumented community. And Stephen and I have worked together on the wetlands in Valdivia, Chile.
Great, thank you, Jason. So do you think that the name that we give urban nature really matters, or are we just sort of splitting hairs and fretting over inconsequential nuances?
It's really tough to give an answer on that, because I kind of go back and forth on this too, honestly, where there's just sometimes, and maybe it's just a product of being in academia, where you're really just like, I cannot handle another term right now. But that said, I think there are plenty of papers, you've interviewed Dan Childers, for example, that I think do outline some critical components of the debate and make a pretty convincing case of why these different terms matter. And I mean, for me, more than anything else, they just kind of symbolize the evolution of the field itself. And I think a good example of this is probably just within the single term of green infrastructure. And I think, Stephen, you and I had a conversation about this, where we were talking about doing a green infrastructure episode, particularly about the wetlands. And I think you made some comment about how a certain group of people did not actually consider wetlands green stormwater infrastructure. And I was just in such disbelief of the idea that somebody could think otherwise, that I just told you must have misheard. But I was totally wrong on that. So I guess, so these things really do matter. It's interesting coming in at this late stage, I guess, in the evolution of these concepts, because, I've totally missed all the debates that have led up to this point, and that have effectively defined the words as we conceive of them. So, I'm relatively new to this, and so I certainly have no baggage with a term like GI, and see absolutely no reason why you can't fold wetlands into it. But I guess there are people who do think that. And I think that's probably true with these other terms, and has kind of, more or less provided the necessity for the development of additional terms or refining of those terms Dan Childers, of course, recommends the use of urban ecological infrastructure instead of green infrastructure. And that's largely because of the sort of history of the development of these terms, which on the surface may seem unimportant if you're not, well basted in the discourse, but are actually critical once you're in here.
So you referred the urban wetlands in Valdivia, Chile as heritage wetlands, and I haven't heard other people use that sort of terminology before. So could you explain a bit what you mean when you say heritage wetlands and the significance of that word choice?
Yeah, so I think I cribbed the idea behind that originally from a 2014 publication. Gosh, let me check. Um, yeah, I cribbed it from a publication by an author named Heidi Correa called Self-Organizing Processes in the Urban Green Commons, the case of the Angachia wetland in Valdivia, Chile. So an actual Valdivian scientist, I think this was part of her master's work, produced this paper on basically how these groups in Valdivia came together in order to promote the conservation of a particular wetland and how that turned into this larger movement. But the people who formed these groups, I believe, identified these wetlands as part of their natural heritage, or the heritage of the land itself is the heritage that they've received, basically. And then I think, truth be told, I think there was also a billboard in Valdivia that was actually a beer advertisement that talked about our natural heritage or something like that, and showed an image of the wetlands.
Yeah.
So part of the story is very Homer Simpson, and well, I read it on the billboard. But yeah, so the term heritage wetlands for me is sort of a critical distinction that I haven't seen discussed it in publications either, but I would probably want to produce something about this. And so part of it is just these wetlands and these green spaces are more than just green infrastructure or urban ecological infrastructure. They're really characteristics. I mean, their identity. They're part of the identity of the landscape, and in turn, that landscape is part of the identity of the people that live around it or live within it. And so when we talk about this sort of esoteric discussion about ecosystem services of these lands and things like that, one of the services that it can provide is a sense of identity, a sense of culture, a sense of place, which on paper looks really flat, but when you're thinking about the sort of internal the internal side of it, or how you feel about the area that you live in, that sort of identity component of the landscape is really important, at least on a personal level. And then I think additionally, even if you get into the other ecosystem services, the idea of a sort of heritage wetland actually does provide some useful information. So for example, I think it's Minnesota that has this development law where there's no net loss of wetlands in the state, which basically has given license within some degree of regulation to destroy a lot of the natural wetland area of Minnesota, so long as a new wetland is constructed elsewhere. And so I think there's been some opportunities, I know there's been some opportunities to actually study the differences between these sort of constructed wetlands and the undisturbed or the heritage wetlands within Minnesota. And there's plenty of papers that show anything from biodiversity to the cycling of chemical nutrients is distinct between those two different types of wetlands. And in fact, there's been, I think, long-term studies, and I feel like they're around the 10-year, maybe a little bit more range, that have shown that these constructed wetlands never actually achieve, or by after 10 years have still not achieved the levels of chemical cycling that these heritage or these sort of spontaneous wetlands actually have. So this is to say, I think heritage touches at the personal identity aspect of these wetland features or these other green features in the landscape, but I think there's also some critical ties to other ecosystem services that we wouldn't necessarily think about. Yeah, I hope that wasn't too rambly.
No, that was great. That was great. Yeah, so I guess now I'm sort of curious. So as a researcher, like, so you are not, from Valdivia, Chile, but spent a lot of time down there, and you were studying, these urban wetlands, and you weren't necessarily studying them for their cultural ecosystem services that you were mentioning before. So I guess how do you think that adopting this sort of terminology and framing of heritage wetlands, how does that impact the sort of work that you were doing, and will continue to do?
Yeah, tough question. So let me think about this. So I think the important part about naming them heritage wetlands, for me anyway, it's like a reminder every time that I think about it in those terms that uh, these wetlands aren't just like green infrastructure. Like I'm affecting the citizens of this city basically, and altering their identity by making these sort of recommendations for changes to the landscape, especially for a characteristic of the landscape that's so like integral to the experience of Valdivia and is so integral to how people interact daily. I mean, you have to walk by these wetlands all the time. The city smells like wetlands as you're like walking through it. And I mean that like in a pleasant way. I don't mean that in a way where it smells like the sulfur, uh, rotten egg sort of thing. It actually smells like quite nice. Um, so I think this sort of like heritage acknowledgement is just a way of me recognizing like this is important to the people in this area beyond the ability of this wetland to provide the removal of nitrogen or some other chemical before it like reaches the coast, or some relatively anodyne sort of conception of why wetlands are critical in a city. And then I think, especially within the context of Valdivia, I really felt a sort of pressure to acknowledge the wetlands as being critical to the people, especially because Valdivia has a relatively large population of Mapuche that I didn't find out until basically like a year and a quarter of being there, that there were Mapuche groups holding religious and cultural ceremonies at wetland sites like across the city. And I just wasn't invited to any of them previously, but just over time, as I spent more time in the city and made more connections, I started getting invited to them. And so like these wetlands are a really big deal to a portion of the population. And I think it's really critical to acknowledge them as just being more than like the sum of these ecosystem services, that we find in a chart in the Millennium Ecosystem Service Assessment. So I think that's kind of what's most useful about it or for me, like on a personal level. And then I think again, there's utility in talking about even the differences in the level of services between these sort of heritage wetlands and a reconstructed wetland or a newly constructed wetland.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there with sort of, I think the importance of that term is really highlighting the very explicit and important connections between those wetlands and the people that live in and around them. Because I think sometimes with other sorts of green infrastructure sort of terms, like, I don't know, bioswale, green roof, whatever, they're a bit more sterile, and don't necessarily evoke the sort of, I don't know if emotional is the right word, but it doesn't really evoke the same sort of strong tie between the people and the sort of infrastructure features that we're talking about. So I think you totally hit the nail on the head. I think it's a great explanation.
Yeah, and I mean, like it's really easy to sort of conceive of like I'm back home with family and my house is next to a creek, and like if you took away the forest and like undergrounded that creek or something like that, like the entire landscape would be totally alien to me and just like wouldn't feel like it does now, and I wouldn't have the sort of connections to my childhood growing up here and like being along that creek. There's just so many, it's part of the heritage of like this of this place, and it's your heritage because your predecessors have decided actively or by default to conserve these areas. And that's, what you were born into. It's your heritage.
Yeah, so now I'm sort of thinking about how you might build up an infrastructure feature so that it becomes a sort of heritage
Yeah.
feature. So like in the case of the wetlands in Valdivia, for example, for those who don't know, many of the wetlands are moderately new, formed by a large earthquake in 1960, I think.
Yep.
Um, so there are people that live in the city of Valdivia that were alive before a lot of these wetlands were there, and yet they have such a distinct effect on the cultural heritage of the city. So I'm wondering now, like, is it possible that we can create this sort of similar sort of heritage cultural values with other sorts of features? Like, could you make a city really identify with like the bioswales that we're putting in on the sides of
Right.
corners of our streets? What would we need to do to develop that sort of more holistic cultural attachment to these sorts of features that we're implementing?
Yeah, I mean that is a sort of an interesting case with Valdivia, because I remember when we were first going down there, I think we were told at least some of the citizenry weren't that fond of the wetlands because it had some associations with this really traumatic event that killed a lot of people and really changed the look and feel of the city. By which I mean the 1960 earthquake that generated these wetlands. So yeah, I mean I think it's something that is malleable, certainly. Um, but I think it's, yeah. So like it's tough to imagine like thinking of bioswales and being like, yeah, that's like the part of the city. But who knows? I mean, read any literature or memoirs, and people will bring up like, oh, I had this like bike accident near this thing. It was like just part of this various set of circumstances and features that make up people's lives, and you accumulate experiences over the years. Maybe you saw fox next to these things, or I think just over the years, sure, they can kind of become part of the heritage of a city, but that takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of experiences, and probably also good to think about positive and negative aspects of your heritage too. Like some of this we've talked, I think, in previous episodes about sort of ecosystem disservices. So you can imagine like some features being like, good, I'm really glad they got rid of that thing, quite frankly.
Yeah, right. Or the instances, where people of certain ethnicities were just flat out prohibited from using certain,
Sure.
green spaces in cities. And there's, many examples of that in the United States and in other countries as well. So yeah, you're right. There are some, negative, potentially negative heritage sort of values associated with some of these spaces. That sort of need to be addressed.
Yeah. Sort of like a funny anecdote from like here. So when I first came back, I was looking for hikes to do around because that's what I spend a lot of my time doing. And I found this one place called like Sunflower Park, which advertises having some tall grass prairie. So I live in Kansas. I should be clear about that, or I'm from Kansas, I should say. So I'm back home in Kansas visiting family. And so I went out to this place called Sunflower Park, which advertises having some native trees and some native tall grass prairie to the region. And I was like, great, it's beautiful. It's a little flat for a hike, but hey, I'm from Kansas. That's what I'm used to. And I go out there and it's really beautiful. And there's like deer and everything else, but it's actually built on a former munitions plant from World War II that was called Sunflower Munitions. And it turns out it's a super fun site. And that's why they can't build anything there. So they just let the tall grass come in, and they're letting the environment basically remediate the site over time. But I mean, to the locals who live around that, they're going to have this like great tall grass prairie that they grew up with and that they could go escape to. That's just going to be part of like the heritage of the region. Hopefully, never again turned back into a munitions plant.
Yeah, hopefully not. All right, well, that's all the questions that I had for you. So, yeah, thank you so much for sitting down and talking about this. I had a really great time and learned a lot.
Yeah, thanks. Glad to do an episode on this side.
Okay, that's all we've got for today. If there's another term that you like to use to refer to urban nature, or if you have thoughts about the terms we introduced today, let us know on Twitter at FutureCitiesPod. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time. And to take you out, here are a series of haikus that Dan Childers wrote about urban ecological infrastructure.
You ready for this?
I'm ready. Yeah.
Okay. I think I counted the syllables right.
Okay, great.
So you want me to do it quickly or slowly?
However you'd like.
Okay. UEI, which I think is 3 syllables.
That is 3 syllables. That checks out.
UEI concept. UEI is inclusive. Nature in cities. GI confuses. NBS for engineers. UGS isn't wet. We cannot forget aquatic and wetland parts in urban concepts.
The Future Cities podcast is an outreach effort brought to you by the Urban Resilience to Extremes Sustainability Research Network, or UREX as we usually refer to it. To learn more about UREX, visit www.sustainability.asu.edu/urban resilience. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions for future episodes, you can email us at futurecitiespodcast@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at FutureCitiesPod. If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.